Hello and welcome. My name is Evgeny Rusakov and you're watching TVP World, interview from Vilnius. Russian propaganda and disinformation continue to evolve, adapting to new crises, new narratives and new audiences. In 2025, Lithuania faced a range of information attacks, from major international events to sensitive domestic issues. To take a closer look at how these narratives work, how effective they are, and what we can expect next, we are joined today by Urtė Andriukaitytė, disinformation analyst at the Civic Resilience Initiative. Urtė, glad to see you in our studio. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me here.
So, first of all, how do you find 2025 Russian propaganda and disinformation-wise?
I'm not gonna lie, the year was very intense, and it's hardly a surprise that Russian disinformation campaigns uses any emotional or huge event, and we were extremely generous with events for them this year. So not only we had a lot of work to do as disinformation analysts, but the whole society also faced a huge wave of disinformation throughout the year.
How about your colleagues from other Baltic states? From Latvia, from Estonia?
Yeah, the situation is very similar. It's been like this for years. We were going hand in hand with Latvia and Estonia, but especially with few highlighted events, and I think we're going to talk about them today as well. I think Lithuania could be the so-called leader in this field.
Okay. Oh, so on a scale from 1 to 10, how would you rate Lithuania's ability to counter all those attacks?
Having in mind how active and how continuous it was, the whole disinformation campaign, I would positively rate Lithuanian effort to combat disinformation. Of course, I cannot give neither 10 nor 9 for this effort, but keeping around 7 and 8, having in mind that we combated a lot, but there's still a lot to do. So yeah, I'm kind of positive on that. Of course, way more attention for the media literacy and other efforts should be paid attention, but I think 7.5 should be enough.
Okay. Well, pretty much, that's high. That's high, I have to admit. So again, what role do Lithuanian politicians and society play in this regard? I mean, in countering disinformation and propaganda.
On a positive note, more and more Lithuanian politicians, and most of them are in opposition right now, acknowledges disinformation as a huge threat and a problem that needs to be solved right now and not ignored for later. The more pessimistic note is that our politicians have a lot of things to deal with at the moment, and it's not clearly disinformation related. So my attention in this question would rather go to civic society, and actually this is what raises our overall score in combating disinformation, because we saw that throughout the year more and more either individuals or some kind of communities are talking about disinformation, and more well-known people are talking about this issue, even in some kind of podcasts that are usually meant for comedy material. Even those people are talking about disinformation and raising awareness about the issue. So I think civic society is taking a huge role in it.
One of the biggest topics in 2025 was this sad incident with 4 US troops in Pabrada. So how did Russian propaganda react to this?
So mainly, and it started with anti-NATO narratives, and I think it's important to note that first time this year, since the full-scale invasion in Ukraine break off, first time anti-NATO narratives took over anti-Ukrainian sentiments in Lithuanian disinformation. And it is super closely related to the event in Pabrada. And yeah, just after the accident happened, anti-NATO narratives were the primary ones.
Like what?
Disinformation spreaders were talking that NATO is not a guarantee of security, but is a problem or a threat for Lithuania. They were mocking Lithuanian dependency of on NATO for their security, talking like, look, they cannot even like normally coexist in our country. We are trusting our defense on them primarily. Of course, that a lot of financial burden is meant to hold NATO troops in Lithuania, and that it's not totally not worth it. Narratives change even after when the vehicle was extracted from there, and a lot of conspiracy theories happened, and narratives switch even from anti-NATO to anti-government, that saying that Lithuanian government is on purpose hiding some details, that is just a huge plan to spread panic and something similar.
Let's not forget the main goal of all this disinformation campaign was just to put some I don't know, disbelief in our government, in our authorities, right?
Of course, starting with disbelief in our international partners, and then going to disbelief in our own government.
Okay, let's move on. Another important topic in 2025 was negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, with the US being a mediator in those negotiations. So what can you say regarding this one? What are the main messages that Russian propaganda was spreading, and how did its narratives change throughout the year?
The main reason was just to picture Ukraine as the bad guy in every situation, and that's why it twisted when Zelensky and Ukraine, of course, as a whole, was pictured as not wanting the peace, right? And the narrative went to, look, Russia is aiming for peace, and US is the one, the negotiator for the peace, and so Zelensky and Ukraine
is the main problem.
Exactly. So that was the main narrative, and even though it slightly changed from throughout the time, but the biggest switch happened at the very beginning when US stepped in as negotiator, and then Zelensky was the one who is not aiming for peace and is willingly wanting to prolong the war based on very different theories emerged, but basically for financial success.
Okay, and another relevant topic here in Lithuania was just, well, it started happening like, what, month, 2 months ago, those balloons that carried smuggling. And the subsequent closure of Lithuanian-Belarusian border after that. So what was the reaction of Russian and Belarusian propaganda to this specific topic?
It was a fine mix of anti-government and anti-NATO narratives as well. All the balloons were also...
Why anti-NATO, by the way?
Because we are... According to Kremlin disinformation, we are so dependent on our international partners to secure us.
NATO cannot protect our sky.
Exactly. Okay. And even with such a, how they say, simply balloons, right? If your so-called international savers are not able to protect us from these balloons, how do you imagine that they are going to protect us in an actual conflict, right? And similarly, anti-government narratives, of course, were very present. They were blaming both the government as such, opposition, Ruginiene, our prime minister, everyone. It was everyone's fault. And a lot of different narratives also emerged that, for example, talks about increasing sanctions for Belarus emerged. And they were greeted with, come on, we cannot conflict with our such close neighbors. So it's a classical narrative, but it was like a huge mix of all those, while Lithuanian people actually had to replan their trips, and a lot of course, a lot of questions emerged. Is it a beginning of actual physical conflict and so on?
By the way, what was the most catchy narrative of all those that you saw in regards to this topic?
To this topic, anti-government narrative that we cannot handle ourselves like this situation, even though it's not that huge in physical side, right? So I think, yeah, there was an additional good accelerator for anti-government narrative.
How vulnerable is this topic to our Lithuanian society?
It was very vulnerable, and primarily because they were personally, a lot of people were personally touched by this, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so at some moment it became some kind of meme or a joke that I don't know whether I'm gonna fly tonight or no, but actually, like, moving out from all these jokes, it was actual problem, and thousands, not only Lithuanians, but of course tourists coming to our country were affected. And if tourists cannot come to our country, of course, our economic system can be affected. So yeah, it was taken very, very personal, and thus had a huge effect.
Okay, again, another question. How was hostile propaganda reacting to recent events linked to Lithuanian public broadcaster, LRT?
As mentioned before, we were generous with different events for Kremlin disinformation, and this is, of course, one of them. It also became a very huge basis for anti-government sentiments spread, and Kremlin disinformation for a long time tried to convince Lithuanians that Lithuania is a failed state and cannot handle itself, of course, and any kind of domestic problem is being pushed towards this narrative, and this whole protest related to LRT is just a very good sign for them that something is going
on. That's right. That's
yeah.
Right. Okay, my last question then. What are we entering 2026 with? Propaganda and disinformation-wise, how are we able to counter all the hostile stuff that we will have to face in 2026? And I'm pretty much sure that we will have to face that.
I think we're entering 2026 with a lot of challenges ahead of us. We saw that throughout the years, recent years, the efforts of propaganda is going not only in size, like more effective or more active, but also more professional and hardly to note. So I think there's going to be a lot of efforts to affect us from the inside. Of course, we're already seeing that any kind of decisions related to LRT is supposed to happen after the New Year's. So we're already starting with very convenient events for Kremlin disinformation spreaders.
Do you think you can predict the next narratives that could be used by propaganda against Lithuania?
I think narratives are going to be very similar. I think we're still, anti-government narratives were still number one for the fans. I think anti-NATO, of course, it depends on the events that's gonna happen, and I think we can hardly predict some kind of tragedies that we already have this year. So I think the narratives are going to be the same, but the events are gonna be dragged to confirm them in a way. As we saw that emergence of anti-NATO narratives, I think it's some kind of a long-term strategy from the Russian side to cut all the ties from our international partners. And it's not only related to anti-NATO, but it was also mentioned about being a part of European Union and so on, just to slowly dragging us to the eastern side of our so-called friends in disinformation language. So yeah, it's gonna be a very tough year, I must say.
Good luck to you then.
Thank you, we'll need that.
And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
And I would like to remind our viewers that our guest for today was Urtė Andriukaitytė, disinformation analyst at the Civic Resilience Initiative. You're watching TVP World. Stay with us.